They were the hidden menace of the Vietnamese jungle, a silent, lurking threat concealed in the depths of the forest. When they attacked, they left nothing but destruction behind. These fierce warriors were unafraid to use themselves as bait, luring the enemy into battle. They were the only force that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong feared. They were the tigers and dragons of Vietnam, the brave soldiers of the South Korean armed forces. In the early years of the Cold War, few nations harbored such strong anti-communist sentiment as South Korea. Between 1950 and 1953, the South Koreans fought the communist regime from North Korea to defend their freedom. Ultimately, it was only with the help of a US-led coalition that they managed to repel the enemy from their land. However, even though peace was established, the conflict was far from over, and the South and North Koreans continued to hold strong hatred towards each other. At approximately the same time, tensions escalated in Vietnam, a nation that, like Korea, was divided into a communist North and an anti-communist South. The South Koreans were among the first to offer help to the United States, which backed the regime of South Vietnam. In 1954, South Korean President Syngman Rhee offered to send Korean troops to assist in Vietnam. It was their way of showing gratitude to Americans for helping them in their own struggle against communism. At that moment, the government in Washington turned down the offer. However, when the threat of communist insurgents in South Vietnam grew too severe in the mid-1960s, the U.S. decided to change its stance on the involvement of allied nations in the Vietnam conflict, including South Korea. In 1964, preliminary discussions with the Republic of Korea led to the deployment of their first non-combat units. These included a mobile army surgical hospital, MASH, and Taekwondo instructors who provided medical and self-defense training support. They were followed by the Dove Unit, a construction support group tasked with rebuilding war-damaged areas. But as the war intensified, the need for armed troops became apparent. In 1965, both the United States and South Vietnam requested more military involvement from South Korea. Responding to this, the South Korean government sent two major units to Vietnam: the Capital Division, known as the Tiger Division, and the 2nd Marine Corps Brigade, called the Blue Dragon. The arrival of Tigers and Dragons in Vietnam during the second half of 1965 was a significant shift in the level of Korean commitment. Unlike the earlier non-combat units, these units were heavily armed and prepared for direct engagement with the enemy. In 1966, at the request of the Republic of Vietnam, another Korean unit arrived in the country, bringing the total number of Korean soldiers to nearly 45,000. This last unit was known as the White Horse Division. Reinforcements from South Korea were a significant asset to American military presence in Vietnam, so much that the government in Washington decided to fully finance their engagement and provide all the logistical support they needed, from weapons to transport and basic provisions like food. However, despite being equipped and supplied by the American military, Koreans retained full control over their troops. This autonomy was a matter of pride and confidence in their military abilities. Indeed, the South Korean armed forces had come a long way since the days of the Korean War. Soldiers who came to Vietnam were fierce and well-trained warriors, as we're about to see. The Tiger Division was stationed near the city of Quy Nhon, an area of great strategic importance. From this location, the Koreans were supposed to secure Highway 19, a crucial communication for the movement of supplies and troops. The Blue Dragon Brigade was initially stationed in the Cam Ranh Bay area, but was soon moved to Toi Hoa, a region that faced intense pressure from the North Vietnamese army. The Blue Dragon Brigade was tasked with countering this threat, which required them to engage in heavy combat to push the enemy back and protect the people living in the area. The White Horse Division was stationed at the junction of Highways 1 and 21, a location critical for controlling the movement of supplies and troops across the region. Undoubtedly, the Americans had a strong faith in the capabilities of Korean soldiers. They were assigned vital roles in maintaining open communication with supply lines, which were essential to the success of Allied operations. Their formidable combat record would show that the Americans had all the reasons to trust their fighting skills. Korean troops in Vietnam closely adhered to U.S. Army doctrines, yet adding a slight touch of their own. What distinguished the Koreans from other Allied troops, including the Americans, was putting extraordinary focus on planning, coordination, and discipline in conducting operations. Koreans were particularly impressive in search and destroy missions. Korean companies moved into assigned areas with platoons lined up and spaced 150 to 200 meters apart depending on the terrain. One platoon always stayed back to guard the headquarters and act as a reaction force if there was contact with the enemy. This method ensured that the main force could focus on the mission. Platoons most often used a V formation or inverted wedge during movement. This setup allowed them to easily surround enemy forces or villages. The lead squads would encircle the target from both sides, while the rest of the platoon would either sweep the area or attack the enemy depending on the situation. The Koreans always made sure all movement had proper coverage from other units to prevent surprise attacks. They were patient and moved only when fully prepared. Sometimes the same area would be searched multiple times by different platoons to make sure nothing was missed. Units would leave their areas only after commanders were satisfied they had thoroughly searched it. And although such an approach sometimes took too much precious time, it always provided remarkable results. A good example of how Koreans fought in the jungle was Operation Hongkil-dong, conducted by the Blue Dragon Brigade in July 1970 in the Phu Yen province. The goal of this operation was to prevent the North Vietnamese 95th Regiment from gaining strength and taking control in the region. The Korean troops deployed multiple units to the area to search for enemy formations, closing them slowly to make sure no gaps were left in their lines. This tactic allowed them not only to pinpoint the enemy, but to push them into a smaller area where they could attack effectively. Once they got the enemy cornered, they attacked them by combining stealth approaches with surprise attacks. In this manner, they kept the North Vietnamese under constant pressure, leaving little room for counterattacks. The success of Operation Hongkil-dong was evident in the high number of enemy casualties compared to the minimal losses suffered by Korean troops. By the end of July, they had killed 408 enemy soldiers while losing only 17 of their own, resulting in a remarkable kill ratio of 24-1. By comparison, the average kill ratio for American troops in Vietnam ranged from 10-1 to 15-1 in major battles. In jungle search and destroy missions, however, American troops achieved far lower ratios, ranging from approximately 2-1 to 5-1. Additionally, the operation led to the capture of a large number of enemy weapons, which further weakened the enemy forces. By late August, the operation was concluded successfully. The region was stabilized and the enemy's influence was significantly reduced. Such an outcome perfectly demonstrated the strength and effectiveness of the Korean tactics in combat. The Koreans applied the same disciplined approach to preparing ambushes, becoming masters of setting traps in the jungle. In this, they outclassed even the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers. Korean ambush forces usually consisted of a squad reinforced with one or more machine guns. They set up their positions along trails with machine guns placed on the flanks about 20 meters from the path. Every ambush site was thoroughly reconnoitered before it was occupied. The troops moved into position at dusk or under the cover of darkness, ensuring they stayed hidden from enemy eyes. Korean soldiers paid great attention not to make any changes to the natural surroundings that could give away their position. They did not cut trees or clear fields of fire, nor did they dig in to avoid leaving signs of their presence. For similar reasons, they made sure to follow strict noise and light discipline. Faces were blackened, and all equipment was taped or tied down to prevent noise. Troops communicated using tugs on a rope or radio wires strung between their positions. This prevented any unnecessary movement or sound that could reveal their presence to the enemy. Once in position, the troops waited quietly for the enemy to enter the killing zone. They showed great patience, remaining awake and alert throughout the entire ambush period, no matter how long it lasted. In some cases, soldiers spent entire nights waist-deep in water, holding their position until the enemy arrived. No shots were fired until the enemy was well inside the zone, ensuring maximum effectiveness. This method allowed them to catch the enemy off guard and deal a significant blow before the enemy could react. Indeed, the Koreans brought a unique approach to combat in Vietnam, shaped not only by their thoroughness and discipline, but also by the passion and commitment that drove them. Namely, not many troops were prepared to do what the Koreans did at the Battle of Trah. On the night of February 13th through 14th, 1967, the 11th Company of the 2nd South Korean Marine Brigade, stationed near the village of Trah in South Vietnam, was surrounded by 2 Viet Cong regiments. However, unlike similar sieges during the war, the Koreans were fully prepared for this scenario. In fact, they had orchestrated it themselves. Instead of searching for the enemy, they established a base and used themselves as bait to lure the Viet Cong out of the forest. That night, the Viet Cong attacked from all directions, supported by heavy mortar fire, trying to overwhelm the Koreans. The Marines responded with aggressive return fire, using machine guns and dropping mortar rounds at point-blank range. Despite being largely outnumbered, the Koreans held their ground. Thanks to their numeral superiority, the Viet Congs eventually broke the outer perimeter. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting broke out. One wounded Marine, refusing to be taken alive, pulled the pins on 2 grenades as the enemy entered his bunker. Then, Captain Chung Kyung-yin, commanding the defense of the base, made a bold move, one that would be remembered and talked about long after the battle ended. He ordered his men to withdraw to the center of the base, thus allowing hundreds of Viet Cong fighters to enter the base. Once they were inside, Chung sent 2 squads to close the gap behind them and order the rest of his men to fix bayonets. The Koreans charged at the trapped enemy, engaging them in brutal close combat. The enemy was too surprised by this move to react properly. By early morning, the Marines had retaken their camp and driven the remaining Viet Cong fighters back into the jungle. As the dust of combat settled, the bodies of 254 dead Viet Cong fighters lay scattered across the base. The 11th Company lost only 11 men. For his leadership during the battle, Captain Chung received South Korea's highest military honor. All Marines within the company were promoted 1 rank. Their actions at Trah quickly became known across South Vietnam, earning them a Presidential Unit Citation. Even South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu visited the unit to acknowledge their courage. By the 1970s, it had become clear that the South Vietnamese and American government forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified of our next video. Stay tuned.